Sarah rushed around her bedroom, applying makeup and selecting jewelry. The sound of her high heels clicking on the hardwood floor drowned out Lucas's weak coughs from the next room. She glanced at the clock, realizing she was already running late for the party. Reluctantly, Sarah entered Lucas's room. The boy lay in bed, his face flushed and hair damp with sweat. She placed a hand on his forehead, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. Lucas looked up at her with glassy eyes, his voice barely a whisper as he asked, "Mom, can you stay home tonight?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "It's just a little fever, honey. You'll be fine." She reached for the thermometer on the nightstand and quickly took his temperature. The display read 102 degrees Fahrenheit, but Sarah convinced herself it wasn't serious enough to cancel her plans. "I'll be back before you know it," she said, adjusting her dress. "There's soup in the fridge if you get hungry." As Sarah grabbed her purse and car keys, Lucas called out again, his voice strained. She paused at the door, torn between her son's needs and her desire for a night out. The choice was made when her phone buzzed with a message from her friends asking where she was. "I promise I won't be long," Sarah called over her shoulder, closing the front door behind her. Lucas sank back into his pillows, feeling abandoned and scared. He reached for the TV remote, hoping to distract himself with cartoons. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the window. The storm intensified quickly. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by booming thunder that shook the house. Lucas pulled his blanket tighter around himself, his fever making him shiver despite the warmth. On the TV, cheerful animated characters danced and sang, but Lucas couldn't focus. His head pounded, and the room seemed to spin whenever he moved. He called out for his mother, forgetting in his feverish state that she had left. As another crack of thunder rattled the windows, Lucas curled up into a ball, feeling more alone and frightened than ever before. Sarah drove through the worsening storm, windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the deluge. She was already regretting her decision to go out, but pride kept her from turning back. Suddenly, her car sputtered and jerked. Warning lights flashed on the dashboard as the engine died. "No, no, no," Sarah muttered, coasting to a stop on the shoulder of the road. She turned the key repeatedly, but the engine refused to start. Rain hammered the roof, creating a deafening roar inside the car. Sarah peered through the windshield, hoping to spot approaching headlights, but the rain formed an impenetrable curtain. She reached for her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed a taxi service. After several rings, a harried voice answered. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're completely overwhelmed right now. The storm has caused multiple accidents, and we're prioritizing emergency calls. It might be hours before we can get to you." Sarah's frustration mounted as she tried other services, only to receive similar responses. She slammed her fist against the steering wheel, the reality of her situation sinking in. She was stranded, and Lucas was alone. Meanwhile, Lucas tossed and turned in his bed, discomfort and fear keeping him awake. He fumbled for his mother's old phone on the nightstand, the one she'd given him for emergencies. His small fingers struggled to dial her number as another wave of dizziness washed over him. The phone beeped insistently. Lucas squinted at the screen, his vision blurry from fever. The low battery icon flashed mockingly before the device went dark. He dropped the useless phone, a sob escaping his parched throat. Thunder crashed overhead, making Lucas flinch. Shadows danced on the walls, distorted by flashes of lightning. He huddled under his blanket, wishing desperately for his mother's comforting presence. In her car, Sarah stared at her phone, debating whether to call for help. She knew she should reach out to someone about Lucas, but shame held her back. How could she explain leaving her sick child alone? As rain continued to pour, Sarah realized she had trapped herself in a situation with no easy escape. Lucas's fear intensified as the storm raged on. He remembered his mother mentioning an emergency flashlight in the kitchen drawer. Gathering his courage, he stumbled out of bed, legs weak and shaky. The house seemed unfamiliar in the dark, shadows looming in every corner. Lucas inched along the hallway, one hand on the wall for support. When he reached the kitchen, he fumbled through drawers until his fingers closed around the flashlight. As he switched it on, relief washed over him. But the moment was short-lived. In his haste, Lucas knocked over a vase. It shattered on the floor, startling him. He stumbled backward, bumping into the counter. Suddenly, a loud pop echoed through the house, followed by darkness. The flashlight had caused a power surge, tripping the circuit breaker. Lucas froze, paralyzed by fear in the pitch-black kitchen. His fevered mind began to play tricks on him. The shadows seemed to move, taking on monstrous shapes. He remembered the bedtime stories his mother used to tell, tales of creatures that lurked in the dark. Now, in his delirious state, those imaginary monsters felt all too real. Lucas retreated to a corner, sliding down to the floor. He hugged his knees to his chest, shivering uncontrollably. Tears streamed down his face as he whimpered, calling for his mother over and over. Meanwhile, Sarah had finally managed to flag down a taxi. Relief flooded her as she climbed in, giving the driver her home address. But her relief was short-lived. They soon found themselves stuck in gridlock traffic. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. The driver shook his head. "Looks like an accident up ahead. This storm's causing chaos everywhere." Sarah's thoughts raced to Lucas. She imagined him alone, scared, possibly getting worse. Guilt gnawed at her as she realized the full weight of her irresponsible decision. "Please," she begged the driver, "isn't there another way?" He sighed, scanning the sea of red taillights ahead. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're stuck here for now." Sarah slumped back in her seat, a mix of frustration and fear overwhelming her. She closed her eyes, silently praying that Lucas would be okay, all while knowing that any consequences would be entirely her fault. Lucas, still huddled in the corner, realized he needed help. His fever was getting worse, and the monsters in his mind weren't going away. With trembling determination, he decided to try reaching the front door. He crawled on all fours, his progress painfully slow. Each movement sent waves of dizziness through him, but he pressed on. The carpet felt rough under his palms, anchoring him to reality as he inched forward. When he finally reached the door, Lucas used the doorknob to pull himself up. His small hands fumbled with the lock, fingers slipping on the cold metal. After several attempts, he managed to turn the deadbolt, but opening the door proved too much for his weakened state. Exhausted and defeated, Lucas slid back down to the floor. He leaned against the wall, catching his breath and gathering what little strength he had left. He knew he had to keep going, had to find someone to help him. Outside, Mr. Johnson, the elderly neighbor, was bringing in his trash cans despite the storm. He heard a faint thumping sound coming from Sarah's house. Curious and concerned, he approached the front door. "Hello? Is everything all right in there?" he called out, knocking on the door. Lucas heard the voice and mustered all his energy to reply. "Help," he croaked, his voice barely audible over the rain. Mr. Johnson, alarmed by the weak response, tried the door handle. To his surprise, it opened easily. The sight that greeted him was shocking. Lucas, pale and trembling, collapsed on the floor. "Oh my God," Mr. Johnson gasped. He quickly knelt beside the boy, feeling his forehead. "You're burning up. Where's your mother?" Lucas couldn't answer, his eyes fluttering as he fought to stay conscious. Mr. Johnson didn't waste another second. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911, requesting an ambulance immediately. As they waited for help to arrive, Mr. Johnson wrapped Lucas in a blanket and tried to keep him calm. "Help is on the way, son. You're going to be okay," he reassured, though worry creased his brow. Meanwhile, Sarah was still stuck in traffic, growing more frantic by the minute. She pleaded with the taxi driver to find an alternate route, any way to get her home faster. But the driver, hemmed in by other vehicles and floodwaters, could only shake his head helplessly. "The hospital's closer than your house from here," he suggested. "Should we head there instead?" Sarah hesitated, torn between her desperate need to get home and the growing fear that Lucas might need medical attention. Little did she know, an ambulance was already racing towards her son, sirens wailing through the stormy night. The hospital emergency room burst into action as the ambulance arrived with Lucas. Doctors and nurses swarmed around the small, feverish boy, their voices urgent but controlled. They quickly transferred him to a gurney, calling out vital signs and medical orders. Among the medical team was Mark, a seasoned pediatric nurse. He noticed Lucas's frightened eyes darting around the unfamiliar faces and equipment. Mark leaned in close, his voice gentle. "Hey there, buddy. I'm Mark. We're going to take good care of you, okay?" Lucas managed a weak nod, comforted by Mark's kind demeanor. As the team worked to stabilize him, Mark stayed by his side, explaining each procedure in simple terms and offering reassurance. Meanwhile, Sarah finally arrived at the hospital, having convinced the taxi driver to change course. She burst through the ER doors, wild-eyed and disheveled. "My son Lucas. Where is he?" she cried out. A nurse directed her to the pediatric wing, where Sarah witnessed a flurry of activity around Lucas's bed. She froze in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sight of her son hooked up to various machines, looking small and vulnerable. Dr. Chin, the attending physician, approached Sarah. "Are you Lucas's mother?" At Sarah's nod, he continued, his tone serious. "Your son's condition is critical. He has a severe case of pneumonia, exacerbated by apparent neglect. We're doing everything we can, but I need to know how long he's been sick." Sarah's world seemed to tilt on its axis. The full weight of her actions crashed down on her as she struggled to answer the doctor's questions. Shame and guilt threatened to choke her. As she waited anxiously for news, Sarah found herself in a quiet corner of the waiting room. Her mind drifted to her own childhood, memories she'd long suppressed bubbling to the surface. She remembered her mother, always out at parties, leaving young Sarah to fend for herself. The loneliness, the fear, the desperate need for attention, it all came flooding back. Sarah realized with a start that she had unconsciously fallen into the same pattern, repeating the cycle of neglect with Lucas. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she confronted this harsh truth. She had become the very thing she had resented, the absent mother she had sworn she'd never be. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, terrified of losing Lucas when she had been the one pushing him away all along. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the hospital windows, Sarah made a silent vow. If given the chance, she would break this destructive cycle. She would be the mother Lucas deserved, the mother she had always wished for herself. Dr. Chen approached Sarah, his face grave. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to talk about Lucas's condition." He led her to a quiet consultation room, the fluorescent lights harsh against the sterile walls. "Lucas's pneumonia is severe," Dr. Chen explained, his voice measured. "The delay in treatment has caused complications. We're doing everything we can, but I need to be clear, your son's condition is critical." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. "What do you mean critical?" she whispered. Dr. Chen's eyes were sympathetic but direct. "The infection has spread significantly. We're battling not just the pneumonia, but also the risk of sepsis. The next 24 hours are crucial." I have to ask, why wasn't he brought in sooner? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she explain her negligence? The shame was overwhelming. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Chen continued, his tone softening slightly, "I understand that parenting can be challenging, but neglect of this level, it could have long-term consequences for Lucas's health." Sarah nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, long-term consequences. What had she done? After the consultation, Sarah made her way to Lucas's room in the pediatric ICU. She paused at the doorway, taking in the sight of her son. Lucas lay unconscious, his small body dwarfed by the hospital bed and machinery surrounding him. The steady beep of the heart monitor was both reassuring and terrifying. Sarah approached slowly, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch Lucas's arm. For the first time, she truly saw her son, not as an inconvenience or a responsibility, but as a vulnerable, precious human being who depended on her completely. "I'm so sorry, Lucas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." As Sarah sat by Lucas's bedside, lost in her thoughts and regrets, she didn't notice the group of women gathering outside the room. They were mothers from Lucas's school, who had heard about the situation through the community grapevine. One of them, Elena, tentatively knocked on the doorframe. "Sarah? We heard about Lucas. We're here if you need anything." Sarah looked up, surprised and somewhat wary. She had never been close to the other mothers, always too busy with her own life to engage. Elena stepped into the room, followed by a few others. "We've put together a care package for you both," she said, placing a bag on a nearby chair. "And we've set up a meal train for when Lucas comes home." The unexpected kindness broke through Sarah's defenses. She burst into tears, overwhelmed by the support she had never known she needed. As the other mothers surrounded her with comforting words and gentle touches, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be the mother Lucas deserved, with a little help from her newfound community. Days turned into weeks as Lucas slowly recovered. Sarah rarely left his side, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair and existing on hospital cafeteria food. She watched every small improvement with a mixture of relief and lingering guilt. During this time, Sarah began attending therapy sessions in the hospital's family support center. Initially reluctant, She found herself opening up about her past, her fears, and her overwhelming sense of failure as a mother. It's a process, Sarah, her therapist, Dr. Marquez, reminded her gently. Recognizing the problem is the first step. Now we work on breaking the cycle. Sarah also joined a support group for parents of hospitalized children. Hearing others' stories made her feel less alone, though she still struggled with shame when sharing her own experiences. Meanwhile, Lucas formed a special bond with Mark, the pediatric nurse who had been there since his admission. Mark's gentle humor and unwavering patience provided comfort to Lucas during painful procedures and lonely nights when Sarah stepped out. One evening, as Mark was checking Lucas's vitals, he noticed Sarah watching them interact. "You know," he said casually, "Lucas here is quite the brave little guy. He gets that strength from somewhere." Sarah looked skeptical. "I doubt it's from me," she murmured. Mark shook his head. "Don't sell yourself short. You've been here every day, fighting for him. That counts for a lot." His words stayed with Sarah, planting a seed of hope that perhaps she could change, could be the mother Lucas needed. As Lucas's condition improved, allowing for longer periods of consciousness, Sarah knew she had to have an honest conversation with him. One quiet afternoon, she perched on the edge of his bed, her heart racing. "Lucas, sweetie," she began, her voice trembling. "I need to tell you something important." Lucas looked at her with those innocent eyes, still tired but alert. "I made a big mistake," Sarah continued, fighting back tears. "I should have been there for you when you were sick. I should always be there for you. I'm so sorry." To her surprise, Lucas reached out a small hand and placed it on hers. "It's okay, Mommy," he said softly. "You're here now." His simple forgiveness broke something open in Sarah. She gathered him gently in her arms, mindful of the 4 lines, and held him close. In that moment, she silently renewed her vow to do better, to be better, for the sake of this precious child who still loved her unconditionally. As they embraced, neither noticed Mark watching from the doorway, a small smile on his face. He knew the road ahead would be challenging for both of them, but this moment of connection was a promising start. After weeks of treatment and recovery, the day finally arrived for Lucas to be discharged. Dr. Chun gave Sarah detailed instructions for Lucas's continued care at home, emphasizing the importance of follow-up appointments and medication adherence. As Sarah packed Lucas's belongings, a mix of emotions washed over her. Relief at leaving the hospital warred with anxiety about the responsibilities that lay ahead. She glanced at Lucas, who was chatting excitedly with Mark about going home. "Remember, buddy," Mark said, ruffling Lucas's hair, "you've got to take it easy for a while. No superhero stunts just yet, okay?" Lucas nodded solemnly, then broke into a grin. "But I can still watch superhero movies, right?" Sarah watched their interaction, a pang in her chest. She approached Mark as Lucas was distracted by a goodbye card from the nursing staff. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything." Mark smiled warmly. "You're both fighters. Just keep moving forward, one day at a time." The drive home was quiet, Lucas dozing in the back seat. Sarah's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as she mentally reviewed her new priorities. Work would have to take a back seat. Her social life, once her main focus, now seemed trivial compared to Lucas's needs. As they entered their house, Sarah was struck by how different it felt. The space that had once seemed confining now represented a second chance. She helped Lucas settle on the couch, arranging pillows and blankets to make him comfortable. "How about we watch one of those superhero movies?" she suggested, earning a delighted smile from Lucas. That evening, as Lucas slept peacefully in his own bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by get-well cards and casserole dishes from neighbors. She picked up a note from Elena, the mother who had organized the support at the hospital. "We're all rooting for you both," it read. "Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. The community she had long ignored was now a lifeline, offering support she never knew she needed. The next day brought a new challenge. Lucas's school had organized a small welcome-back gathering in their front yard. As Sarah watched Lucas interact with his classmates from the porch, she overheard snippets of conversation from the other parents. Poor child, all alone when he got so sick. Where was his mother? "I can't imagine leaving my kid like that." The whispers stung, but Sarah steeled herself. She stepped off the porch and joined the group, forcing a smile. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Lucas and I appreciate your support more than you know." Some parents nodded politely, Others looked away uncomfortably. But Elena stepped forward, linking her arm through Sarah's. "We're just glad Lucas is home and getting better," she said loudly, effectively silencing the whispers. As the gathering dispersed, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with judgment and self-doubt. But for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone in facing it. A month after Lucas's return home, Sarah attended a support group meeting for parents at the community center. As she shared her experiences and the changes she was making, a woman named Rachel interrupted her. "How could you leave your sick child alone?" Rachel's voice was sharp with accusation. "What kind of mother does that?" The room fell silent. Sarah felt her face flush with shame and anger. She took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Marquez's advice about confronting her past actions. "You're right to be upset," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "What I did was wrong. But I'm here because I'm committed to changing, to being better for my son." Rachel scoffed. "Some things can't be undone. That poor boy will always remember being abandoned when he needed you most." Sarah clenched her fists, fighting the urge to lash out or flee. Instead, she met Rachel's gaze. "You're absolutely right. I can't change the past, but I can shape our future. Every day, I work to rebuild trust with Lucas, to be the mother he deserves." Other group members shifted uncomfortably, but a few nodded in support. The facilitator stepped in, redirecting the conversation, but Sarah could feel Rachel's glare throughout the rest of the meeting. Later that week, Sarah sat with Lucas as he worked on a school assignment about family. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "can I invite some friends over this weekend?" Sarah's heart leapt. This was the first time since his illness that Lucas had shown interest in socializing. "Of course, sweetie. Who would you like to invite?" As Lucas rattled off names, Sarah listened intently, making mental notes. She was determined to make this playdate perfect, to show Lucas and herself that she could be relied upon. The day of the playdate arrived, and Sarah had prepared snacks, games, and even a small craft project. As she watched Lucas laugh with his friends, a warmth spread through her chest. This was what she had been missing all along. That evening, after the other children had gone home, Lucas hugged Sarah tightly. "Thanks, Mom. That was the best day ever." Sarah held him close, blinking back tears. "I'm so glad, sweetheart. We'll have many more days like this, I promise." As she tucked Lucas into bed, Sarah noticed an envelope on her nightstand. Curious, she opened it after leaving Lucas's room. Inside was a letter, the handwriting unfamiliar. "Dear Sarah," it began. "You don't know me, but I knew your mother." Sarah's hands trembled as she read on. The letter detailed a history of neglect, not just Sarah's childhood, but her mother's as well. It spoke of a cycle of abandonment and misplaced priorities that had spanned generations. "Your mother never found the strength to break the cycle," the letter concluded. "But you have taken the first steps. Don't give up." Sarah sank onto her bed, overwhelmed by the revelation. The patterns she had struggled with weren't just her failures. They were a legacy she had inherited. But unlike her mother, she had chosen to fight against them. With renewed determination, Sarah reached for her phone. She pulled up the contact for her therapist, Dr. Marquez, and typed out a message. "I need to dig deeper into my family history. I'm ready to face it all, for Lucas's sake and my own." As she hit send, Sarah felt a mix of fear and hope. Breaking the cycle wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she truly believed it was possible. Weeks passed, and Sarah continued her journey of self-improvement and rebuilding her relationship with Lucas. One day, as she was leaving another support group meeting, she overheard a familiar voice in the hallway. It was Rachel, the woman who had criticized her so harshly before. "I can't believe they let that neglectful mother keep coming here," Rachel was saying to another group member. "She doesn't deserve a second chance." Something inside Sarah snapped. She had been patient, understanding, and apologetic for weeks. But now, armed with the knowledge of her family history and the progress she'd made, she felt a surge of righteous anger. Sarah approached Rachel, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Excuse me, Rachel. I couldn't help overhearing. I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Rachel turned, surprise and disdain warring on her face. "What could you possibly have to say?" "I know what I did was wrong," Sarah began. "I've acknowledged that repeatedly. But what you don't know is the full story." Sarah took a deep breath and continued, her voice growing stronger. "I recently learned about a cycle of neglect in my family that goes back generations. My mother did the same to me, and her mother before her. But unlike them, I'm fighting to break that cycle. Rachel's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. You stand there judging me, Sarah pressed on, but have you ever considered what drives someone to make such terrible mistakes? Have you ever thought about the courage it takes to face those mistakes and work to change? The hallway had gone quiet, other group members watching the confrontation with wide eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness or approval, Sarah said, but I'm asking for the chance to prove that people can change. My son deserves that chance. And so do I. To everyone's surprise, it was Elena who spoke up from the crowd. Sarah's right. We've all seen how hard she's been working. If this group is about support and growth, shouldn't we be encouraging that? Rachel looked flustered, her earlier confidence crumbling. I didn't know about your family history, she mumbled. No, you didn't, Sarah replied, her tone softening slightly. And that's the point. We never know someone's full story, but we can choose to support each other instead of tearing each other down. As the tension in the hallway dissipated, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had finally stood up not just for herself, but for every parent struggling to do better. Later that evening, as Sarah and Lucas sat together reading a bedtime story, there was a knock at the door. Sarah opened it to find Elena and several other mothers from the support group. We wanted to check on you, Elena said warmly, and to let you know we're here for you, whatever you need. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she invited them in. As the group settled in her living room, sharing stories and offering support, she looked over at Lucas. He was smiling, clearly enjoying the lively atmosphere. In that moment, Sarah realized that she had gained more than just personal growth from this ordeal. She had found a community, a support system that would help ensure she never fell back into old patterns. As the evening wound down and Sarah said goodbye to her newfound friends, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but she was no longer walking it alone. Sarah tucked Lucas into bed, kissing his forehead gently. I love you, sweetheart, she whispered. Love you too, Mom, Lucas replied sleepily. You're the best. Those simple words, once a source of guilt, now filled Sarah with determination. She had been given a second chance, and she was going to make the most of it for Lucas, for herself, and for the generations to come.